Okay, everyone. Thank you for being here today. It's wonderful to see many friends and familiar faces. Before I start, I would just like to thank our colleagues at Dara for their generous invitation and generosity and hospitality. So thank you. My presentation today is about architecture, and urban planning in Jerusalem during the period of British rule, which lasted roughly 3 decades. So we're talking about the period between 1917 and 1948. And my talk today bridges my previous work on colonial planning in Palestine and my new project on the architectural profession in the modern Arab world, which I started working on a couple of years ago when I was at MIT and now at ETH Zurich. And so, although the focus of today's presentation is on Jerusalem, the project really sits within a broader research agenda on the first generation of architects in the modern Arab world. And this work is culminating in a few outputs, including this forthcoming book titled Arab Modern, which will hopefully come out next year. This is the outline of my talk today, which will be divided into 3 main parts. The first part is more of a background about Jerusalem during the British Mandate, and it focuses more on the colonial schemes for the city's development. The second part shifts the focus towards exploring the unwritten history of Arab architects in Mandate Palestine, focusing on one specific architect named Rushdie Husseini and his main works in Jerusalem. The third section will move from this individual architect into a broader sketch of what was happening to the architectural profession more widely in Palestine during the Mandate and its connections to the profession's development in the broader Arab region. So let's start with some background. The British advance to Palestine in World War I was by way of Egypt. And although the Ottomans, who had ruled Palestine for 4 centuries, and the German allies started the war very confidently, they were soon met with a series of major defeats on the Palestine front. And so by the end of October 1917, the British have occupied most of southern Palestine, including the cities of Gaza and Bir Saba. And within no more than 2 weeks, the British advanced further into central Palestine, disabling Ottoman and German communications and strategic railway lines. By early December 1917, British armies had taken full control of Jaffa and had their troops positioned outside Jerusalem. Here you can see the territories occupied by the British by December 1917. And you can see Jerusalem marked with a blue circle on the map. Now, despite the high political and moral stakes that were associated with the capture of Jerusalem, the event of Jerusalem's surrender to the British was far from glorious. Anticipating their imminent defeat, the Ottoman army and its German commanders fled Jerusalem ahead of British advance. They left the city in the hands of its Arab mayor, expecting him to deliver the city's surrender to the British. On the morning of the 9th of December 1917, 2 British surgeons were scouting around the old city's walls, searching for water, still unaware that the Ottoman army had retreated. To their surprise, they were met by a group of Arab dignitaries holding a white flag, who asked them to accept the surrender of Jerusalem. This photograph documents the event. And by the way, there's a painting by Nicola Sayer based on this photograph that's here on display on the column, which I encourage you to have a look at. And in this photograph, you can see the Arab mayor of Jerusalem at the center of the photo, and the 2 overwhelmed soldiers on the left. Now, the 2 soldiers returned to their superiors with the news that Jerusalem had surrendered. They took with them the flag of surrender as an evidence, which they asked the Arab mayor of Jerusalem to sign. This is a photograph of the flag and the signature, which is kept at the Imperial War Museum archives in London. And the reason I include this is because, as you will see throughout this presentation, there are always 2 parallel stories taking place hand in hand. On the one hand is the story of historical events, And the second is the story of the archives, where the material artifacts of this history end up. But let's go back to our story of Jerusalem's occupation. Now, unsurprisingly, the main commander of the British Army in Egypt and Palestine, General Allenby, was dissatisfied with the real story of how the surrender of Jerusalem actually took place. And so 2 days later, he returns to the city with an army of soldiers and an army of photographers to recreate the ceremony of Jerusalem's capture. This is some footage from that ceremony. Again, this is 11th of December, so 2 days after the actual surrender. And here you can see Jerusalemites gathering to attend it. And this is the main western gate to Jerusalem, also known as Jaffa Gate, or Khalil, which is where Allenby enters the city from. On the right, we're slowly seeing the citadel. And on the left is the Ottoman clock tower, which we will return to. And now this is the scene where Allenby enters Jerusalem from Jaffa Gate. And I want you to pay attention to the fact that he's entering by foot. And he's followed by his main aides, including T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia, as well as his soldiers. This is a quite iconic photograph from the same event, signed by Allenby himself. Now, the fact that Allenby dismounted off his horse and entered the city on foot was deliberate. It was an explicit reference or comparison to an earlier visit to the city by Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany in 1898, who insisted on entering the city on his white horse. And so a breach was made for him in the historic city walls of Jerusalem, as we can see in this diagram, right here specifically. And until today, this is the only part of the old city walls in Jerusalem that's open, and it's between the citadel and the Jaffa Gate. And we can see it more clearly in this photograph, also in this one up here to the left. And so in contrasting himself with Kaiser Wilhelm, Allenby wanted to signify that the British were not occupiers, but humane liberators who understood the sensitivity of the Holy City. This attitude also reflected in the speech he delivered in front of the city's residents the same day. And here we see him standing on a raised platform right in front of the city's, the citadel's gate. And this is the text of his speech on the right, where Allenby announced that the city was now under martial law, as long as military considerations make it necessary. And he assured the city's population that the British understood the importance of maintaining the status quo. And I quote from his speech: "Since your city is regarded with affection by the followers of 3 of the great religions of mankind, I make known to you that every religious building, monument, holy spot, and shrine will be maintained and protected," end quote. And so since the start of British rule in Jerusalem, Allenby realized the importance of urban planning as the main instrument through which he could maintain political order in the city. And so he immediately orders British planner Sir William Maclean, who was the chief colonial planner in Alexandria, to prepare a master plan for Jerusalem. And the main logic of his plan was to divide Jerusalem into 4 different zones with different building regulations. The first zone was the old city of Jerusalem, which was easily delineated as the city within the historic walls. And this is where all sensitive religious institutions and monuments are located, which the British wanted to preserve. And so construction in it was prohibited. Now what's interesting is that the prohibition of new construction was not limited to the walled city, but also extended into a buffer zone surrounding it. And this is something we'll return to later. The third zone was an even larger ring that surrounded the eastern part of the city, where construction was allowed, but only under special approval. And this is quite important because it begins to reveal some distinction in the treatment of Eastern and Western Jerusalem. And finally, there's this whole scheme, which we see in blue, on the western side, which is declared the zone for new development. Now, Allenby left Jerusalem soon after commissioning the Maclean Plan. And so it was the man he left behind to govern the city, Sir Ronald Storrs, the military governor of Jerusalem, who really took charge of the city's future. Now, Storrs was quite known for his artistic interests. T.E. Lawrence, who served with him in Egypt, described him as, and I quote, the most brilliant Englishman in the Near East, although he diverted much of his time to music, sculpture, and painting, end quote. And the reason I mention this is because it reflected clearly how he approached his job as the military governor of Jerusalem, which was in maintaining Jerusalem's aesthetic harmony as a precondition for upkeeping the city's sacramental and political status quo. And although the Maclean Plan had already been commissioned, he realized that Jerusalem needed a much more sustainable urban planning effort. And so in 1918, Storrs founded the Pro-Jerusalem Society, which was broadly aimed at, and I quote, the preservation and advancement of the interests of Jerusalem, its district, and inhabitants. These are two reports from the society, and we can see its emblem at the center of the report. And it includes the symbols of all three monotheistic religions, a cross, a Star of David, and a Muslim crescent. And it really shows us the sectarian lens through which the British approached Jerusalem's population, which saw religious identity as the main vehicle for understanding its urban composition. Now, immediately after establishing the society, Storrs appointed British architect Charles Ashby to serve as the society's civic advisor. Now, if you've heard of Ashby before, you probably know that he is one of the leading figures of the arts and crafts movement in England, with William Morris. But what's less known about Ashby is that he played a significant role in the planning of Jerusalem, the legacy of which we still live today. Ashby saw Jerusalem as an open-air biblical museum. Although he was not religious himself, he was quite obsessed with the idea that Jerusalem as what he called a city of the mind. And he was very invested in how the city would look like from the outside. And so he came up with the idea of creating a whole green belt surrounding the old city, so that the old city must be clearly distinguished from the new developments outside the walls. But this, of course, meant destroying all of the buildings that were already built in this zone, most of which were Arab-owned shops. So it was a quite violent process. And we can see that he relied heavily on panoramic photographs, which depicted the Canaanite conditions, and under them, he would sketch his own vision for the future of the city. This is one example from Damascus Gate, and we can see in the photograph above that there were many distinguished shops adjacent to the walls, which do not appear in the diagram below, and so they had to be destroyed. And this is an example of Yaffa Gate, where also all obstructions had to be destroyed. But I'd like you to pay attention to the small note on the top right margin of the panorama, where Ashby writes, "This tower has to go." And this takes us back in full circle to where we started, at the entrance of Yaffa Gate, where Allenby entered Jerusalem in 1917. And again, we see the Ottoman clock tower, which Ashby eventually removed, because he saw it did not fit the medieval character of the old city. Now, architecturally, we can, of course, be critical of that clock tower. And Jerusalemites, too, found that its design was a bit odd. One funny description of it is by this gentleman, Wasif Jawhari, who actually worked briefly in the Pro-Jerusalem Society with Charles Ashby, but was later kicked out for showing up drunk to work. And this is what he wrote in his memoirs about the architect who designed it. And I quote, "He adhered to the Oriental architectural style, but his exuberant use of ornamentation, which was due to him being a graduate of the French universities, resulted in a mix similar of the great master to the music of the great master Muhammad Abdul Wahab, or the Franco-Arab style, as they call him. Now, despite his ironic comment, Jawhariya adds that he was upset that the clock tower was destroyed, not much because it was an Ottoman artifact, but because it was a civic monument. And I think this really sums up how British colonial planners in Jerusalem, including Ashby, did not consider how Jerusalemites would experience the destruction they caused under the pretense of urban planning and preservation. Some power. Now, what I told you so far is based on research I was working on over the past 5 years or so, which focuses on colonial architecture and planning. Now, as I was doing this research, I would constantly come across the names of Palestinian figures who were involved in architecture and planning under British colonial rule, but whose history is completely forgotten. And so this is what I'm working on now for the past couple of years or so, and it's very much still a work in progress. Now, unlike work on foreign architects, which is relatively easier to trace in colonial archives, the stories of Palestinian architectural figures are much harder to trace. The only key work that I am aware of that tried to do this is Adina Hoffman's book, Till We Have Built Jerusalem, Architects of a New City, which came out in 2016. And the book focuses on the story of 3 architects in modern Jerusalem. The first is British architect Austin Barb Harrison, and the second is German architect Eric Mendelsohn, both of whom are quite well known. The third figure, meanwhile, is a relatively obscure Palestinian architect named Spiro Khoury. And this is how Hoffman describes writing about him. I quote, "In the summer of 2014, I set out through the streets of Jerusalem in the search of a ghost. My account of that search forms the last section of the book, Till We Have Built Jerusalem, which focuses on 3 very different figures who helped construct the modern town. Both Mendelsohn and Harrison left sizable archives so that it was possible to reconstruct the history of their fraught time in the city. The biographical traces of the third architect, meanwhile, an elusive figure named Spiro Khoury, have all but been erased." And so her book actually tells us very little about the architect, and more about how difficult it is to piece together his story through colonial archives. Now, of course, this is quite understandable. But I think as historians, it's important for us to engage with other kinds of sources beyond the colonial archive in order to write an actual narrative about Palestinian architects and not only ghost stories. And to me, this is not about retrieving the story of Spiro Khoury specifically, but it's about an entire generation of Palestinian professionals who have been entirely erased from historical memory. And so I decided to start my research this time not from colonial archives, but from a Palestinian directory published in 1945. Now, directories like this are of course very limited, but this one proved particularly useful in at least identifying the names of some of the well-known Palestinian architects during the British Mandate. And some of the names are already familiar to me, but the directory included useful information such as their birthplace, their city of residence, and where they received their education. And as I was looking through them, one particular figure stood out for me, and that's Rushdie Imam al-Husseini. And the reason he stood out is that he was the oldest of them all, having graduated as early as 1913, so before the start of British rule, and also because it appeared that he worked with some significant public projects in Jerusalem, and not only private ones. And so this really started a journey for me to try and find out more about this architect. Now, luckily for me, I was able to get in touch with his grandson, architect Hani Imam al-Husseini, who's based here in Amman and who's also with us here today. I think the resonance is quite clear. And so I came to Amman and met with Hani a couple of years ago, only to learn that he inherited the entire personal collections of his grandfather. In this picture, you can see Hani holding a notebook from his grandfather's library, and you get a sense of how extensive the collection is in the background. And so it really enabled this for me to start tracing his life and career through his records. And so using the following timeline of his career, I will share some key episodes that are relevant for understanding Rushdie Imam's personal trajectory, but also his contribution to architecture and the architectural profession in mandate Jerusalem. And so what we know is that Rushdie Imam al-Husseini was born in Jerusalem around the year 1890. So he's born and raised in Palestine when the country was still under Ottoman rule. And he goes to school in Jerusalem. And as far as we know, he was one of the first Palestinians to go to study engineering at the Higher Technical School in Istanbul. And he completes his engineering degree and graduates in 1915. And this is an official Ottoman document he held immediately after graduating, which certifies his status as a degree-holding engineer. Now, Rushdie did not leave Istanbul after graduating. In fact, he stayed there and worked for the Istanbul municipality. It's important to remember here that this was a period of Turkification throughout the empire. And so for an Arab to work at the Istanbul municipality was quite a challenge. And this was also a quite critical moment for the empire more broadly, as it was about to enter World War I against the Allies. And so in 1915, Rushdie Imam gets sent off to work as a technical engineer on the Ottoman Hijaz Railway. Now, the Hijaz Railway was an ambitious Ottoman endeavor that had predated the war. It was mainly advertised as a project that aimed at connecting the Muslim world and providing a faster pilgrimage route to commute to Mecca for Hajj. But of course, it also had military and strategic interests since the start, which was really heightened during the war. And so Rushdie Imam gets sent off to different parts of the empire where extensions had to be made on the Hijaz for military purposes. This is a military certificate issued in 1916, which stated his assignment to work on the Hijaz railway line. But once we look closely at his name, we can also see that his service earned him the Ottoman rank of a Bey. And so from this point onwards, all of official documentations start to refer to him as Rushdie Bey Imam al-Husseini. Now, upon the surrender of Jerusalem in 1917, Rushdie returned to work in his hometown. But there was little work in Jerusalem during this period, so he decided to go and work on freelance projects in Syria. And it seems that he continued to have a strong connection to Syria throughout his life, which is something that's worth looking into. This is a laissez-passer that he was issued in 1922 to allow him to enter Syria. This is basically after the British and French mandates in Palestine and Syria were established, and so the borders became more regulated. And it's also at this point that Rushdie goes back and settles again in Jerusalem, but this time for a job that would really become a highlight of his career, which is his work for the Supreme Muslim Council in Jerusalem. And before I go further, I just want to explain a little bit about the Supreme Muslim Council. Now, you remember that we spoke earlier about how the British conceived the inhabitants of Palestine through a sectarian lens. Now, the Supreme Muslim Council was the ultimate embodiment of this lens. It was established by the British in 1922 for the purpose of the control and management of the Muslim Waqf and Sharia affairs in Palestine. And in administrative terms, it was subordinate to the British administration. So the British really thought of it as an instrument to have an upper hand over the city's Muslim leadership. But things didn't turn out as expected. And that's because Hajj al-Husseini, the man pictured here, who was appointed as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and the head of the Supreme Muslim Council, was quite critical of the British administration. And later in 1936, he would be involved in what became known as the Great Arab Revolt in Palestine against the British and the Zionists. But Hajj Amin was also battling internal factional struggles within Palestinian politics. And one of the ways he asserted himself as the main Palestinian leader was through large-scale development projects throughout Palestine. And the largest and most ambitious of these projects was the restoration of Haram al-Sharif and Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which started in 1922. This is an area photograph of Jerusalem from the 1920s, and you can see the site of the Haram, including the Al-Aqsa on the left and the Dome of the Rock on the center. And it's a really substantial site, which amounts to nearly 1/5 of the size of the old city. Now, when it came on deciding as to whom would be the Palestinian architect to work on the renovation project, Hajj Amin did not hesitate to choose Rushdie Imam al-Husseini, who is standing right here at the center of this photograph. Now, it's worth noting here that Hajj Amin al-Husseini was actually Rushdie Imam's uncle, so this probably played a role in the decision. But it is also true that Rushdie Imam was one of the most qualified Palestinian architects at the time. We also see from this picture that Rushdie Imam was a part of a larger team, and in fact, he did not hold the most senior position within that team. That position was reserved to the famous Turkish architect Mimar who we can see here to the left of Rushdie. And in fact, Kemaluddin was one of Rushdie's teachers at the engineering school in Istanbul during his time there. And in Turkey, Kemaluddin is considered as one of the leading figures of what is known as the first national movement in architecture during the Republican period. And his designs were often labeled as neo-Ottoman. And that's because he was quite influenced by the classical Ottoman architecture of Mimar Sinan. And this was quite evident in his design for the reconstruction of Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. Now, this is a sketch of Kemaluddin of Al-Aqsa, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. But this is the striking proposal he made for its reconstruction. And you can quite easily tell that his inspiration was the Hagia Sophia and the monumental Suleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul. But it's quite radical in the sensitive context of a city like Jerusalem, and it's not very surprising that his proposal was rejected. And so Muammar Kemaluddin's relationship with the Supreme Muslim Council did not last very long. And instead, it was this other person standing to Rushdie's right who would work with him on the renovation. And his name was Mehmet Binhan. And he was also a quite well-known Turkish architect, and in fact had been working for Kemaluddin in Istanbul for quite some time. Here we can see the list of people who worked on the technical committee of the restoration project, which included architects, engineers, translators, and art specialists. And we can see that Rushdie Imam was hired as the chief engineer, while Mehmet Binhan was the chief architect. And they both received the same monthly salary of 70 Egyptian pounds, which was quite good for that time. This is a photograph showing some of the renovation work at the entrance of the Dome of the Rock. And what's important to note here is that unlike Kemaluddin's proposal, the restoration work had no radical impact on the original structure of the building or the buildings of the Haram Sharif, and actually ended up being quite rushed. And the main reason why the work on the Haram was quite rushed is because Hajj Amin al-Husseini was redirecting money away from this project into another project that he thought was more crucial for the Supreme, or equally crucial, for the Supreme Muslim Council's future in Jerusalem. And to give you a sense of this other project, I will be using this bird's eye view map of Jerusalem from the 1930s. This is Haram al-Sharif, which we can see is quite sizable. This is here in red. And this is Yafa Gate, which you remember from the previous section of this talk. And we remember that it's the main gate separating the old city from Western Jerusalem, which is where colonial architects were planning new developments. And you can already see that by the 1920s and 30s, when this map was made, there had already been some major developments in this new area, most of which were led by the British and the Zionists. Now, Hajj Amin was well aware that this is where the city's future development would lie. And as the custodian of the Muslim mosques, he also knew that he had a huge asset in this new city. And that's the lands of the Muslim cemetery, which you see in blue here on the left. Now, of course, there's not much you can do with the cemetery if it stays in its existing function. And so what the council did is that they selected a small piece of land at the edge of the cemetery, and they decided to invest in it by building a hotel. This is the hotel, which is called the Palace Hotel. And here you can see it more clearly. And this project was important for two main reasons. First, we need to remember here that the Supreme Muslim Council is a Palestinian-run institution, but it's operating within the British colonial system. And so by investing its money in a commercial enterprise like this, it could, at least theoretically, circumvent the financial restrictions of the colonial administration. And second, as we already saw on the map, this area of Jerusalem was already witnessing quite a lot of British and Zionist growth investment. And so by building an Arab institution there, the Supreme Muslim Council could assert Palestinian presence in this part of the city. Now, Hajj Amin was an efficient man, so he hired the same team who was working on the renovation of Haram Sharif to design the Palace Hotel. And so Rushdie Imam was hired to prepare architectural drawings for the new building. This is a floor plan of the building from his private collection, and as we can see, the building's main features, including the main round reception area with the stairs, the two main corridors leading to the hotel rooms, and an open courtyard with a detached central dining area. And here we can see that in his signature, Rushdie refers to himself as both an architect and an engineer, unlike what we saw earlier in the Haram. This is an elevation drawing of the building, and here we can see some other features. And perhaps the most important of these is just how much attention there was on stonework on the street-facing facades. And we can see that more clearly in this detailed drawing of the windows, all of which are ornamented with stone. But this was also the case with the interiors. Here we see the workers as they were placing the capitals of the stone columns at the reception. And what we need to remember here is that stonemasonry was a predominantly Arab industry. So there's a heavy focus on employing Palestinian craftsmen in this project and depending as little as possible on Zionist industries. This is a photo of the building's exterior when it was still under construction. And this is it after completion. And we can see that the building had a quite remarkable presence in the new city outside the walls. But as the main building of the Supreme Muslim Council, the chief representative body of Palestinians during the Mandate period, the building would also gain a national significance that supersedes Jerusalem. This is the Palace Hotel on the day of the inauguration of the National Arab Exhibition in 1933. This was basically one of the first pan-Arab exhibitions, and it brought together arts, crafts, and industries from all over the Arab region for display in Jerusalem. Its main purpose was to bridge the economic and cultural relations between different Arab countries upon their colonial fragmentation in World War I. And since we're sitting here, it's worth noting that the head of the board of directors for the exhibition was Palestinian economist and politician Ahmed Khalil Abdel-Baqi. This is a page from the Jaffa-based Palestinian newspaper celebrating the opening of the first Arab exhibition. And you can see the portrait of Ahmed Khalil Abdel-Baqi on the upper right corner of this newspaper peeping. These are images from an exhibition that we worked on 2 years ago at Khalid Sakakini Cultural Center in Ramallah on the history of these two exhibitions. And we displayed some of the works by pioneer artists who participated in the original exhibitions. And we'll be hosting it in Beirut soon, maybe down at some point. But one of the most fascinating parts about the exhibition is that the board hired an official illustrator for it, who was the late Jerusalemite artist Jamal Badran. And we're lucky to have Samira with us in the audience here today. Here we can see one of the illustrations of John prepared for the exhibition, and it's a postage stamp showing an Arab man holding a source of light with the word Jerusalem written in it, and from it, the light shines to the rest of the Arab world. Take all the photos. And this transitions us quite nicely into the third part of this talk, which is on Palestine within Arab regionalism. And through the example of the Arab exhibition, we can already see that in this period, Palestinians were firmly asserting their economic, cultural, and political connections to the Arab world. Now, the question I ask here is, how does architecture fit within this broader agenda of Arab regionalism? But before I address that, I will first focus a bit on what was happening with the architectural profession inside Palestine. I will start this by moving into one last episode of Rushdie Imam's life, which is his role in establishing the first association for Arab engineers in Jerusalem in 1936. Now, when Rushdie Imam returned to Jerusalem from Istanbul, there were less than 5 or 10 Arab architects and engineers in all of Palestine. But by the mid-1930s, there was a whole new generation of Palestinians who received their training abroad and returned to work in Palestine. And so these Palestinian engineers and architects thought it was important to organize themselves and their profession through some form of collective entity. And so in 1936, a series of meetings take place in Jerusalem under the initiative of Rushdie Imam. This is a memorandum of speech by Rushdie Imam at one of the meetings where he was still making the case for establishing the association. And he says, and I quote, "Our age is the age of collectives, not individuals. The power of the individual, no matter how capable, cannot be compared to the power of an organized collective." End quote. And so by 1937, the collective is formalized into an official entity called the Association of Arab Architects and Engineers. And the emphasis here on the word Arab was not incidental. It was a way to distinguish it from another organization that had already existed in Palestine for a few years, which is the Association of Engineers and Architects Tel Aviv, whose membership comprised of Zionist professionals. Now, the activities of the Zionist architects and institutions are beyond the scope of this lecture. But I'll just give you a quick example of the Levant Fair, which was held in Tel Aviv in 1932. And it was intended to showcase how Zionist architects were devising a new language of regional modernism within Palestine. And here on the right, we see its emblem, the flying camel, with the Levant Fair written underneath. So this is how they thought they can become relevant in the region. And so when the Arab exhibition was organized a year later, it was a direct response to the Levant Fair and the Zionist claim for regionalism. And there's a lot to say about the contrast in the artistic expression of regionalism between the two events. But let's go back to the Arab Engineers Association. Now, immediately upon its creation, the members of the newly established association had to define the parameters of their organization's work. And so in 1937, they wrote a constitution that listed the following 7 items as the main aims of the Arab Engineers Association. First, cultivating a bond between Arab engineers. Second, elevating the state of engineering technically, conceptually, and materially throughout Palestine. Third, improving arts, crafts, and sciences that are related to the engineering professions. Fourth, maintaining the interests of the profession and representing it. 5, mediating conflict between the association's members with their clients. 6, refining and influencing public opinion on engineering. And 7, and finally, encouraging early career engineers to improve their technical skills and knowledge. But what's interesting about looking at the personal papers of Rushdie Imam is that we can see the Constitution when it was still a work in progress. And we can see some revealing edits made by Rushdie Imam in his own handwriting on the early draft. In this case, the original document states that membership in the association is limited to architectural engineers. And then he raises the word architecture to make it open to all engineers. And we can't really know whether this is simply a mistake in the original document or a change in the scope of the association. But it's still quite interesting, especially given how blurry the relationship between architecture and engineering is in this period. This is a second example where the original document mentions that registered engineers should have a minimum amount of training received under the guidance of another engineer. And then Rushdie Imam changes it to the leave-holding engineer. And so we begin to see that in setting the parameters for the profession, there are these very critical decisions that are being made about who can or cannot be considered a qualified professional. Now, it's important to remember here that although these Palestinian architects were getting more organized, colonial architects still held the upper hand when it came to planning Jerusalem. And so this is a zoning scheme prepared by British planner for Jerusalem in 1944, which suggested the expansion of the city's municipal boundaries into nearby Arab villages. But what's remarkable here is that the Arab Engineers Association rejects the British plan and issues a counter-report and submits it to the colonial administration. And as we can see here, these counter-reports received great coverage in local Palestinian newspapers. And this is quite important because usually our critique of colonial planning in Jerusalem is retrospective. But this report shows us that Palestinians were already rejecting these schemes at the time. It also shows us that these rejections were articulated not only in political discourse, but also in architectural and planning terms. Now, although the association's activities focused on Jerusalem, its members saw its long-term vision as establishing a nationwide association. So in 1944, they organized a conference in Jerusalem where they brought in architects and engineers from all over Palestine to discuss the future of the profession. And one of the main outcomes was the creation of 2 new Arab engineering associations in the Palestinian cities of Jaffa and Haifa. But it's important to keep in mind here that the developments in the architectural and engineering professions within Palestine were not unique. Throughout the 1930s and early 40s, similar efforts were taking place in neighboring Arab countries, including the ones you see on this map. This is just an example of the charter for the Syrian Engineers Association, which was formed in 1942, just to give you an example of what was happening in the region. But it's not really until the mid-1940s that these regional conversations surrounding the future of architecture and urbanism really crystallized. And one of the main platforms for this regional exchange and conversation was Majallat al-Amara, a Cairo-based architectural publication which was founded in 1939 by an Egyptian architect. This is his name is Sayyid Karim. Now, when people talk about Majallat al-Amara, they usually focus on its role in forging a national and post-colonial identity for Egyptian architecture. And that's quite understandable because a good portion of the magazine was dedicated to the question of fashion and style, like this one, for example. But I think Sayyid Karim and the magazine had a much broader scope. And that's the regional dimension in Majallat al-Amara's coverage, which is quite overlooked. This regional coverage starts off with a whole section devoted to Islamic architecture in Majallat al-Amara, which tries to situate historical Egyptian architecture within this broader category. And through this category, the magazine starts to allude to other architectural examples from other Arab countries. But these remain focused on historical examples and rarely addressed modern Arab architecture. This changed in 1942 when the magazine introduced a new section which was specifically dedicated to architecture in the Arab region. And this is what the editors wrote to inaugurate it, and I quote, "We are glad that today we are fulfilling yet another main objective behind this magazine, which is to enhance knowledge exchange between us and our colleagues throughout the entire Arab region. مجلة العمارة is the only Arab magazine in Egypt and the Arab East that works in this area of expertise and is capable of achieving this. For if Egypt was the cradle of architecture and the Arab region its home, then مجلة العمارة is its messenger and the best entity working on elevating it and retaining its glory. It is thus a true delight to publish what we receive from the projects of neighboring Arab countries, whether from entities or individuals." Now, interestingly, Palestine was the first example that مجلة العمارة brought up, saying that the country is, and I quote, "rich in its modern architecture and is the leading Arab country in adopting new scientific theories in construction projects," end quote. Now, ironically, the project it highlighted was designed by the colonial architect Mendelssohn, who I spoke about earlier, if you remember. But anyway, it really marked a shift in the nature of مجلة العمار's coverage, which though remained focused on Egypt, became more regionally oriented. And in this period, we start to see Arab architects, especially Egyptian and Lebanese architects, starting to come to work on projects in Palestine. This is an example of the 1945 master plan for the Palestinian city of Yafo, which is really one of the most comprehensive urban design schemes in the Arab world at the time, and it was prepared by an Egyptian planner. And here we can see an entire issue of مجلة العمارة dedicated to this master plan. Now, the regional mobility of people, expertise, and imageries that Arab architects and engineers experienced through the pages of مجلة العمارة foreshadowed a later development that would have a great influence over the future of the profession in the Arab world. And that's the organization of regional Arab engineering congresses that brought architects and engineers from all over the Arab world together to discuss the present and future of the profession. The first of these congresses took place in Alexandria in 1945, and a delegation was sent to it from Palestine, headed by Rushdie Imam. An entire issue of مجلة العمارة was dedicated to the event, and it contained the different speeches delivered, including the speech of the Secretary of the Congress, who said, and I quote, "We inaugurate with this conference a new epoch in the history of engineering in Egypt and the East. It is the first time that such a large gathering of Arab engineers come together to exchange ideas regarding topics that have long occupied public opinion," end quote. But there's also an interesting speech by Sayyid Karim, where he situates Arab engineering congresses within the context of post-war architecture globally. And so he raises the question of whether modern architecture in the Arab world should be thought about in the same terms as European architecture after World War II. And so questions of this sort are quite crucial for us when we look at Arab architects in this period and try to situate them within the global history of architecture in the 20th century. Now, only a year after the first Congress was held in Alexandria, a second Arab Engineering Congress was held in Cairo in 1946. This is a publication of the conference's proceedings, which was published the same year. And here we can see its emblem, which included the main building of Cairo University, which at the time was called King Fouad University. Here you can see an old photograph of the university on the left. And that's actually where the Congress took place. Now, among the numerous speeches and reports included within the proceedings publication, we find the speech delivered by Rushdie Imam at the start of the conference on behalf of the Palestine delegation. And in his speech, he points to a quite important connection between the Arab Engineering Congresses and another important regional entity that was founded in Cairo a year earlier, which is the Arab League. And I think it's quite important for us to pause here and think of how, when we think of pan-Arab efforts in this period, usually it's the Arab League and similar political initiatives that first come to mind. But what's interesting here is that just as Arab politicians were meeting behind closed doors to imagine the future of the region, other meetings were also taking place with a similar agenda, but through a very different lens. And those were the meetings of Arab architects and engineers who were crafting their own sets of future imaginaries through regional exchange, architectural collaborations, and joint efforts. I will end with this very rare photograph of the second Arab engineering congress from Cairo, from the private collection of Rushdie Imam. And this is Rushdie Imam sitting on the lower right side of the photograph. Now, the years after this photograph was taken were quite eventful for Rushdie Imam and his generation of Arab architects. In 1947, a third engineering congress took place in Damascus. As with the previous events, a delegation from Palestine went and attended it, headed by Rushdie Imam, but little did they know that it would be their last. A year later, in 1948, half of Palestine was lost to the newly established state of Israel. The association was dissolved, and like many Palestinians, most of its members became scattered around the world, taking their expertise away from Jerusalem and into other parts of the region. Jerusalem became a divided city. Jaffa Gate was no longer a buffer between the old and new city. It was now a barrier between East and West Jerusalem. Whatever was left of an effort to organize Arab architects and engineers in the city after 1948 was destroyed in 1967 when Israel occupied the remaining part of Jerusalem. For Palestinian Jerusalemites, 1967 remains viewed as the main moment of rupture, further isolating them from the rest of the Arab region. This photograph from the 1946 Congress and the visions and the imaginaries it carried for the Arab region's architectural future reminds us of the material worlds that were possible before Israel. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. It was fantastic. We'll open the floor to any questions. Probably the black.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you for the lecture. It was quite informative. Thank you. I have a question regarding the engineers and architects. I don't know of any university inside Palestine that used to teach architecture or engineering during that period, as in before the British colonial project started. As you mentioned, the names that we heard were graduated from Istanbul or from Beirut or from Cairo. Were there any universities that actually taught architecture inside of Palestine? And regarding the architects that were more disciplined inside the association, were they usually graduating from foreign countries and then they come back to Jerusalem and then they join them? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Would you like to answer this question first? Thank you, that's an excellent question. So within Palestine, there was no Palestinian institution that taught engineering for architecture because there was no Palestinian university. However, the son of one of Rushdie Imam's colleagues, so one of Rushdie Imam's colleagues in that association was named George Schiller. And his son, Sa'adة Schiller, went and studied in different places around Palestine, around the world. He went to Cairo University, actually. In 1946, he goes to MIT, and he writes his master's thesis on basically a scheme to build a design and engineering school in the city of Jerusalem. This is 1947. And it wasn't just a student project. His father actually bought the land, and they were planning to do this. This is money before that. And we have all the documentation of that project. So this is just one of the main projects altered by 1948. So to answer your question, no, it could have been possible. But also, yes, in terms of Palestinians, we're going to regional universities. First, mainly Cairo University, and at a later point, a similar school that was established in Beirut in 1913. And usually they would have one degree from there and go to either Britain or the United States to complete their master's and PhDs at the certification.
How much do we know about other architects and engineers that are operated during that time? There are few names which have come through the association of engineers and architects. But other names which have actually been appearing in the media in various forms to Facebook or whatever media do there is. So there are starting points for changes, but I mean, the amount of substance that is required to portrait or a series of portraits so far seen exactly that have not actually come across much of that or hardly any. There are also the guys up to 2 minutes. Whenever this stable research is involved, and how much work has to be done, where the tools are for pursuing that way, because as we can see, there's a huge danger of all of this lost eternity. One example, the war in Gaza, one of the main things that it is was the beneficial getting into the destroyed archives, which probably are something out of this.
It's very true in point. The names that we do know a bit about are mostly Jerusalem. So obviously, in the Salim Abu Sawwab, we know quite a bit because actually his collection was looted in 48 and is now stored in those State archives. So that's how we get some of the association documents, because these were actually sent to Salim Abu Sawwab, and this is actually his collection of documents. And he was the second president of the association with that Palestine. So we know a bit about his work, for instance, through his family. We know a bit about the Sugars. So George, the father, was pioneer, and his son, Saba Sugar, his daughter and son in the United States, and also generously opening their doors to research students who talk to them, explore further the area. Yeah. So here in the United States. And Saba Sugar was quite relevant, not only because of this scheme, but he later goes and plans the entire city of Kuwait in the 60s, 64. So these are just some examples. There's also an example from Nablus that was more similar to your point about social media, from someone from the Arafat family, who was the municipal engineer of the Nablus municipality in the late Ottoman period and continues to but his long time, as I suspect, is older than by a couple of years. So around the same generation.
I mean, is there much? I mean, all of that is kind of little, almost like excellent here, excellent. My question is these being able to fill out those spaces, you need to see a much more live picture where those people are, what they did, where they work, and what they studied.
Yeah, I mean, the picture of Palestinian social history with Florida is a patched picture in a way. So it is about stitching these narratives that we find here and there. Now, one of the things, for instance, that I think are important right now is to explore regional archives, where we might find documents related to these Palestinian archives. So one example, for instance, happened when I was in Beirut, is that I found the photo of Salim Abu Suwan as one of the first teachers at an engineering school there established in 1913. And we didn't even know that there were Arab teachers at that school, mind you, Palestinian teachers at that Lebanese school. So going around and sort of trying to fill in, even in this last image from the Second Arab Engineering Congress, we don't know many of the faces not only of the Palestinian representatives, but also the Arab representatives, because the pioneers are the missing generation of Palestinian architecture history. Now, the book I showed at the beginning of this presentation, which should come out next year, includes contributions from people all over the region. Again, trying to stitch these narratives that are happening parallel, because I mean, the history is happening in parallel across different countries, but it's also interconnected. Because these architects would meet in engineering congresses. Proceedings of these congresses are very valuable because in them we see the architect not only as a professional that builds buildings, but also as an intellectual that is engaged in social and political questions rather than the professional side. So I mean, these are the kinds of places that we look for in terms of trying to write this narrative. I think in the long run, though, there would be a need to create a public and open repository where people can also contribute to, because I mean, some archives are developing places that are, you know, they're not wrong. So it's it requires patience, I think, in trying to reach out as much as possible and also explore regional connections as much as possible.
Okay, I'm an ultimatist, so I'm gonna go back to the ultimate period. I have two questions. So the first one, why they're kind of related, basically, I was thinking about continuity. From your presentation, there's a sense of like a rupture in the sense that it goes from ultimate to a clear sense of Arab identity in terms of how buildings are approached. I know that the architect was ultimate trained, but there's still this. I'm just wondering how conscious they were of creating a certain Arab sense of architecture, or whether there was some kind of continuity in the first, like in the 1920s. And I guess the second part is pre-First World War, how involved were Arab or Palestinian architects, especially I'm wondering about like the Jamal Pasha era, if there were any architectural, anything happening because this was a war, but also like if there were any Arabs involved in that.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the two questions are quite related. I'll start with the second. There were Arab architects, Arab producers of the building environment. They were mostly master planners by the start of the British Empire. And that was the capacity in which they were mostly. The one exception was municipal engineers who were quite present in the cities and had left quite their mark in the cities, whether we're talking about, especially Yafa and Gambas. Jerusalem was a very exceptional case because of our Jerusalem society. Right? Took away power from the municipal institution and gave it to colonial planners. It wasn't so much the case in other cities where Palestinian municipal engineers had more of a role to play. So that's in terms of the second question. In terms of an Arab architectural identity, if that is what got. Look, I don't think that the Arab architectural identity is inherent. I think it's invented and invented for very particular sets of pieces. For example, the Palace Hotel, which I just showed. If you look at it architecturally, you'll see many influences. You think this is, okay, a merge of Neo-Ottoman, Greco-Roman, Neo-Andalusian. I mean, all of these references are made in subtle architectural elements in that facade and in that style. But if you look at Palestinian newspapers from the 1930s talking about the building, they celebrate it as an Arab style building, which architecturally means nothing, but politically means a lot. So I think this is how we need to weigh the sentiment around creating the need for architecture and for an Arab architectural identity. This need wasn't so much there, I think, until the period of Turkification and then later with the start of the Mandate. It's almost like when you need to invent an identity is when actually that term enters the discourse of art.
Just a follow. So we're usually Iran's example. Is he consciously trying to create an Arab sense of architectural identity, or I'm sure every case is individual, but do you get that from him? Is there a conscious effort?
I think, one of the interesting things about the first founders, actually, of Arab engineering in 1945 is that one of the questions posed is literally, is there an Arab style of architecture? And all the answers were dismissive. All the answers of Arab architects and engineers at the time were very dismissive of this question. They all have that's irrelevant. There's no architecture and we're part of this global way in terms of what they're writing. However, the question of identity resurfaces after 67, actually, when much of there's a lot of crisis when it comes to cultural production in the region, the search for identity after defeat, self-criticism, etc. And architecture becomes part of that conversation. So for the first time in Arab engineering congresses, we start to see the term tradition. It's a post-1967 phenomenon. It happens at the Congress that takes place in Kuwait in 1968. So I think it's interesting to read these categories historically, meaning when is a term invented and later, if you will, tell the circumstances that are happening around it. I think that's more useful than taking them for granted as, objectively. So that's a great question.
Hey, sir.
Thank you. Just a question. I hope the lecture is generally about that literature. You can speak a bit how the separation between East and West before Electrum and the control of the Grand Mufti of the East more and all the development projects there versus the newer developments in the West, how that might influence post-Electrum, the separation between East and West and I don't know if that makes sense. I'm just thinking about after all of this, how it was very much cut in that way, whether you have through your research seen sort of the impact that had afterwards.
It's a great question, and it does require going into further detail about this multiple constructions of East and West Jerusalem, because that line also, it will first plan or show there was some sort of distinction in the at least land negotiation aspect of the factions. It overlaps, but only to a certain extent, with the Armistice line drawn in 1948 within Jerusalem. And that's because that line was mostly drawn after the East Street Battle. Right? So it has a different modus operandi, logic to it. But of course, there is, in a real sense, also one could look at where the concentration of Jewish Roman settlement in the peripheries of Jerusalem was taking place. And it was mostly in this new city built outside the walls. Now, of course, the new city was not only composed of Jewish colonies, it was also a place for your neighbors. Like we, were also around that same time. So I would say that also the internal Anglos were in West Jerusalem, also the populations were in this place. So I would say that this division in the British mind was there in a way, but the stronger division that really formed their planning was actually confessionalism. So sectarian lines drawn clearly separating Muslim, Christian, and Jewish residents of Jerusalem. And you see that actually mostly not only in the city, but this only mention of the four quarters of Jerusalem, which if you look at the city demographically before 1917, they're much more intertwined. But the British wanted to clear cut map, where this is their name, what this is Jewish, what this is. So I think, a lot of revisiting this history requires also a lot of unmoving. It's very clear divisions that bear no real meaning as definite borders historically. But again,
So you mentioned in your lecture that before it was divided on the so each one is a tiny difference. Can you just need a fine example of how different those are they were treated or finding? I can understand the how area, but it's the remainders, how they get it with it, but how was I
was. Yeah, so again, there are multiple schemes deployed at several names. The Larry showed was William McLean's from 1918. But shortly after it, Charles Ashe was in charge. And so then he implemented the whole buffer zone around the whole city, where no building was allowed, no construction at all was allowed, and that was the history of the evil old city that you can build homes. The trickiest part was building the buildings. Things that are only the Arab area. But the old city with larger was very getting in terms of planning procedure. In the new city, there were different sets of municipal ordinances imposed in the 1930s. That required, for instance, these regulations around setbacks. Right. So everything in the new city would have to be built to very clear, kilometers setbacks from the street. So you have this much more focus and attention to the street. There was also the whole code, which I think became very symbolic, but also still functions today in the whole of West Bank and Jerusalem, around stone facades. So all buildings in Jerusalem have to maintain their stone facade. Even though stone was no longer used as a structure, mostly a thin layer like the concrete. So these different codes were mostly implemented in the news, not in those.
What's the problem? Have different value regulations for the Armenian?
No, such. Not within those.
So I was thinking. شكرا دكتور